Big audience for GOAT today.
We're ready to go.
Sitting in the wrong spot.
Yep. All right. Call to order the Governance and Policy Committee. Good morning, everyone. I am Regent Janie Mayron. We're here today for Governance and Policy. We have two items on the agenda that we will be addressing: the Board of Regents Policy Code of Conduct for members of the Board of Regents. This is our annual review. And the second item is the University Policy Overview and 2021 Board Policy Report. Thank you to all of you who are joining us via the live stream video and for those attending in our boardroom here on the Twin Cities campus. Enormous audience, I would note. Not. All right. Okay. The first item on the agenda, at least here live in the room here. The first item on the agenda is the Board of Regents Policy Code of Conduct for members of the Board of Regents, the annual review. This annual review is required by the policy. And at this time, I invite Executive Director Steves and General Counsel Peterson to take us through the review. Executive Director Steves, would you like to start?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and members of the committee. It's really my pleasure to just tee this up and then turn it over to our expert here, which is our General Counsel, Doug Peterson. But I actually want to start by reading a short passage that is not in this policy, just to give some background and framing. This is from a 1928 Minnesota Supreme Court decision that was quite pivotal for the University of Minnesota, but this is what the court wrote. The whole power to govern the university was put in the regents by the people. The management of the university shall be, until the people themselves say otherwise, in a relatively small, slowly changing board, chosen for their special fitness for and interest in the work. The purpose of the Constitution remains clear. It was to put the management of the greatest state educational institution beyond the dangers of vacillating policy and partisan ambition that would be possible in the case of management by either legislature or executive. I think that the spirit of this is exactly the spirit that this code of conduct was drafted in. And I think that when we talk a little bit about the language and the fiduciary responsibilities that are outlined in that document, it's really this spirit that comes through and is kind of infused in that document. And so I know General Counsel Peterson, you're gonna walk through some of that language in more detail, but I just wanted to offer that framing on the front end.
Thank you, Executive Director Steves. That gives us a really good context for the remarks we're now going to hear from the General Counsel. General Counsel Peterson.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair Mayron. Thanks, Brian, for that introduction. Section 12 of the Code of Conduct for members of the Board of Regents calls for this public review of the requirements and procedures of that code and calls for that to be done every year. What I'd like to do is cover that territory by focusing on three highlights. Two of them are fundamental to the code. One is important for me to place of record. The first sort of fundamental thought I would offer you this morning is that the most important provision within that code, and I'll offer you my perspective, I believe the most important provision in all of the policies of the University of Minnesota is in Section 2, the guiding principles section of the Code of Conduct for members of the Board of Regents. That's the section that says that it is your role to define the mission and values of the University of Minnesota. That's a rich mission, as you know: research, teaching, and service. Reaches all 87 counties. It has an impact around the globe. And it's important for you, as part of those guiding principles, to keep the welfare of the entire university paramount. Not your personal interests, not the interests of any particular constituency, but the welfare of the entire university paramount. The second fundamental thread within that code of conduct centers on the three fiduciary duties in Section 3 of the policy. This code was established by the board in 1996. I believe the most significant change to that code occurred in 2020 when this committee moved from what had been a list of 16 duties and 12 responsibilities listed out in the code like a checklist, and you moved over, thanks to Chair Mayron and others, to simply stating your duties as 3 fiduciary responsibilities. The first of those is a duty of care. That means go about your work in good faith to the university, also good faith to your colleagues. It also means do your homework, rely on experts, internal and external, listen to constituents. You had 6 of them here this morning giving you really powerful, thoughtful comments about the budget. That's an example of exercising your duty of care. And in the end, you need to use your own judgment, your own common sense on behalf of the University of Minnesota. Second duty of loyalty. That means undivided loyalty. Free of conflict of interest, actual and potential. The types of conflicts that are addressed in this code are financial conflicts that may involve you or your family. It also means employment-related conflicts. You're also to be free of undue influence, avoiding any significant gifts of any significant dollar amount to you as your role as a regent, and then also from you to government officials and the staffs of those officials. There can be a lot of sort of questions and gray areas in this world of conflict of interest. The policy suggests that you consult with me as your general counsel to the extent any questions arise. And I can offer you that there are a lot of ways to address conflicts, and it's often beneficial to talk those sorts of things through because solutions end up coming to the top once people think through the nature of a particular conflict problem. The third duty of obedience. And in this context, it means fidelity to mission and compliance with law. Put another way, it means stay true to your public mission and also maintain your public accountability. I thought it might be instructive to take a little bit of a detour and compare the Board of Regents to the evolution of responsibility in private corporations, especially so-called public corporations that are for-profit and responsible to shareholders. There's been a sea change in corporate responsibility. My landmark is roughly 1996, following the savings and loan crisis, when federal sentencing guidelines triggered the Delaware Chancery Court to issue a decision that caused boards of directors to start developing compliance plans. Part of the reason why this plan was adopted originally in 1996. After that, Sarbanes-Oxley, whistleblower laws, private attorney general employment laws, and what is currently center stage for corporate America are ESG issues, environment, social, and governance initiatives that lead corporations to look themselves in the eye in terms of their public mission and their public responsibilities. The reason why I make that contrast is that because for the university, those goals are not new. I'll offer you that the regents of the university have always been about public mission and public accountability. That's true long before 1996. These are duties that I trust regents of the university have been having center stage since 1851. So it means it's a tradition that each of you carries on 170 years later. My third and final point to place of record is that Section 5 of the Code of Conduct calls for annual financial disclosures by each regent, and that it also calls for those to be reviewed by the General Counsel. And so I want to confirm this morning that I have reviewed each of your financial disclosure statements and that all of them are in compliance with the Code of Conduct. So with that, Chair Mayron, my remarks concerning the annual review of the Code of Conduct are concluded.
Thank you very much, General Counsel Peterson. And I think you have focused on what really is the driving force behind this Code of Conduct, in particular, as set out in Section 3, where our duties are laid out and remind us that we are servants to and for the University of Minnesota and what is good for the university and then hopefully for the state of Minnesota and beyond. So thank you very much. Any discussion or questions by any of my colleagues? All right, seeing and hearing none, we will move on to the second item on our agenda, which is the University Policy Overview and 2021 Board Policy Report. At this time, I will be asking Executive Director Steves to take us through this, along with Michelle Gross, Director, Policy Program, Office of Institutional Compliance, and Jason Langworthy, Board Associate, Policy and Committees, Office of the Board of Regents. Executive Director, take it away.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Once again, just my pleasure to be able to tee this up a little bit. Yeah, about a decade ago, if you would have taken a look at how board policy reviews happened and how we worked through that work, it maybe could have been described as kind of catch as catch can. I mean, there wasn't a systematized way that policy worked its way through. We had policies that had gone years and years and years without review. We had other policies that had been probably amended 3 times in the prior year, and so we about 6 years ago implemented a very structured process around board policies. And you're going to hear that university policy happens at 2 levels. There's board policy and administrative policy. But on the board policy side, we implemented a very structured process, and we placed each of the board's policies into a class. And those classes are divided across 6 years. And so we are just now coming up on the year 6. So this coming year's work plan is year 6. So it's the first time in that year we would have now gone through the entire group of board policies in that very systematic way. Now you'll see in the board policy report, we've got some, from this last year that we're carrying over into this year, and that we still are, kind of working our way through some of these policies. But we've been able to accomplish a tremendous amount of work on the policy front. This code of conduct for the board that we just reviewed is a great example of that. We've reviewed the board's bylaws and made changes. We've reviewed reservation and delegation of authority and made changes, board operations agenda guidelines. These are massive policies that drive a huge amount of the board's work, and that I'll be honest, people were kind of scared to take on. And we put it in these classes and we said, we're just going to do it. We're going to build it into the board's work plan. And so when you see the work plans and you see these policies coming through, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing the fruit of this work and this planning effort to try and ensure that all of the board's policies remain relevant and that they remain focused on the mission, as Doug was talking about, focused on the mission and ensuring that your voice is guiding how this institution operates. So with that framing, I'll turn it over to the experts, Jason Langworthy from our office and Michelle Gross, who manages the administrative policy work.
Chair Mayron, members of the committee, good morning. Let's start first with the university policy framework hierarchy to sort of put into context the various layers and categories that we have here at the university. So this slide, you can see we have policies from the departmental level all the way up to certainly the university's charter that was established in 1851. 3 points I'll make on this slide before we move forward. First, today's presentation is just going to focus on board and administrative. And so when you look at the list of policies there, policies need to be in alignment with the policy category above them. So departmental policies have to be in alignment with collegiate policies, and administrative policy has to be in line with board policy. The second item I'll note is the frequency in which these policies change is also different as you sort of move up through the hierarchy. Typically, policies lower down are changing more frequently, where certainly something like our bylaws, the board's bylaws, change more infrequently. And then you can see that governmental box there on the side. And that really demonstrates the impact that state and federal laws have on university policies. So, for example, the board, the open meeting law influences both the bylaws and some of our board policies. Things like federal grant requirements influence administrative policy. Title IX, we made adjustments this past summer based on new guidance from the federal government. So there is influence from those governmental regulations as well.
There are 2 governing policies for both of the Board of Regents and administrative, and each one of them sets that framework under which policies are either reviewed, revised, or created. And the same is true for administrative. As you can imagine, administrative policies have a lot more, I'm going to call them details, to the things that we create. That policy alone is substantially larger because we have to have 200 policies follow under those. So we're not going to cover everything here, but we'll highlight some pieces in the rest of our presentation.
And you know it's going to be a very nerdy policy presentation when we start out highlighting the policy on policies on policies. So for both policy classifications, both board and administrative, they are system-wide, so they govern the entire system. They follow a similar revision process and consultation model. There are certainly different steps and obviously different final approval authorities, but they do have a similar system as they move through the university. And the languages aim to be used by the broad university community. Not everyone is a policy nerd, and so we want to make sure that they are usable by the entire university community. Board policy development requires that board policies be written in declarative statements. So let's move to board policies. We currently have 88 policies. They're broken into 6 categories for organization: academic, administrative, board operations, delegation of authority, financial, and human resources. Board policies, as General Counsel Peterson noted, give you the ability to help to define the mission and define sort of the fundamental principles as a basis to guide future and later action by the administration, right? They set the framework in which the university is to carry out the mission as defined by the board. They define reserved and delegated authority. And so this is where certainly the board's fiduciary responsibilities come into play. You speak through policies, you define what decisions are reserved to you, and then what authority is delegated to the president. And then certainly administrative policies then further delegate that administration out through the administration. Board policies are sort of the broad umbrella. I've heard some regions at times refer to them as sort of the constitutional level policies within the university. They're really setting sort of the direction and the guiding principles. There are board policies that have more sort of procedural steps in them. The faculty tenure policy is a good example of that. But oftentimes procedures, how things then actually operate and move forward are typically contained in administrative policies. Finally, board policies, because of the impact that any change in a board policy has, right, sort of rippling down through the rest of the policy framework, they're meant to be more enduring. So they are typically, and we'll talk about the comprehensive review process, and they are typically reviewed less frequently in comparison to administrative policy and amended less frequently. If we were to amend board policies, all 88 every year, I would get a lot of angry emails from Director Gross because of all of the impacts that would have down the line. And so they are meant, and board policy development says that they are meant to be more enduring.
In contrast, we have 200 administrative policies, and we've been standing at that number for more than 10 years now, which is really a testament to the policy owners because they have to go through a lot of work. And we do add new policies every single year, but they've found opportunities then to combine similar policies where possible, or retire policies, which is really an infrequent activities. We have administrative policies for a number of reasons. The first one is to implement board policy. So anywhere we have a board policy that says the president is responsible for creating administrative policies to enforce or to lay out a board policy, that's one of our first directives. But we have a lot of laws and rules and regulations for which we have to have administrative policies, and they change. So that's some of the reasons why we do comprehensive reviews, is to make sure we're always in sync with those. We also use it for management reasons, to address a risk to the institution. So you may see, for example, the travel policy. We do a lot of that, which is not mandated externally, like use of a particular class of airfare. And that's because we choose to manage it. That's a financial responsibility. But we have a number of different things that we choose at an institutional level to have a policy for. Ours are unique because we have actually a set of 4 common documents that come together for the full policy. The actual language in the policy, we have procedures, so how do you actually get that task done? We have FAQs to handle things that were probably more unique and we wouldn't put it at a policy level. And the last thing that we have is we have forms. So there are ways to get the work done. We make sure that these policies help promote operational efficiency and effectiveness. It's critical for us to put the least amount of work in and still achieve the university's goals. And then we do amend them much more frequently. So we will talk about this a little bit later, but we do about 100 minor updates every single month, and contrast that with what you do at board policy level. So we have a lot of activity going around.
And I'll just add one item, board policy development, which defines other university policies, including administrative policy, does note that in unusual circumstances that the board may want to ratify administrative policies. The most recent example of this were the Title IX changes to our sexual misconduct policies, where the board and the administrative policies are so interlinked that the board ratified those administrative policies when it adopted the amendments to the board level policies.
So we have comprehensive reviews, and in administrative policies, this is a pretty big task, and the burden for this task starts with the policy owner. So we want to make sure that the content in the policy still aligns with the mission and the strategic direction for the university. It would be a bad thing to be out of sync with that. Do we still need the policy? We actually asked them to ask themselves that question. Is it still necessary? So for example, we had a policy on influenza. Until this pandemic came, we had a big gap of time where we could have said we don't need that policy anymore. Thank goodness we had already revised it before COVID-19 came. And does a policy align with current practice? We have great people at the university who would notice if the policy is not in sync with what they're told to do. The other opportunity we have is to combine policies, as I mentioned before, and are there some operational efficiencies that we could now reflect? Unlike board policies, ours almost always results in some sort of changes. It might be enhanced language, it might be more FAQs, it might add additional procedure. Board policies, however, don't have as many changes in their documents, including in your comprehensive review. So for the board, it's every 6 years, and for administrative policies, it was a 4-year set time period that we were measuring against. Until recently, we did a policy on policy comprehensive review, and a request was made to allow for an exception to extend that up to the same 6-year period as the board has for those policies that don't change very much. In this case, the advocate for that happened to be the provost for a lot of the education policies that stayed pretty constant.
And as Executive Director Steve's noted that every 6 years that was codified into board policy development, and we're at the final year 6 of that first cycle. So 2 other main types of review we want to highlight for you. OffCycle changes. So these oftentimes focus on specific, essential, and time-sensitive changes. They give us the ability where if something is needed to change outside of that comprehensive review, both on the board and the administrative side, we can be responsive in making those changes. And again, that Title IX is a great example of that, right? Federal guidance changed, those policies needed to be updated. But it doesn't take the policies out of the comprehensive review cycle. I think that's an important note. As Executive Director Steve said earlier, when things were getting amended, there wasn't sort of the time to ask those sort of comprehensive questions. So we want to make sure that those questions are still asked, even if the off-cycle changes were extensive We still want to make sure that we're going back and we're asking those questions. And that's why, definitely on the board policy side, we might not see as many amendments. And then the technical change, there are sometimes minor corrections needed, things like updates to titles. For the administrative policies, there are a lot of campus contacts listed in there. Those change depending on what the content of the policy is. So just going in and making those technical corrections, but they don't alter the substance of the policy. So let's talk broadly through then the policy review cycle. And this is true of comprehensive review, but also certainly off-cycle changes. Technical corrections don't follow this. So if we start at the top of the policy review cycle, we first define the policies for review. So that would be, we would look and say what policies are up for comprehensive review this year, both on the administrative and the board side. We then would notify, for us, for board policy, we call them policy implementers. They are the senior leaders that implement the policies. You call them policy owners, and they tend to be a little bit more distributed throughout the administration. And we would notify them, your policies are up for review. The second step then is to make sure that the implementer or policy owner is performing a comprehensive review. So answering the questions that Director Gross outlined for you, taking time to talk with impacted groups, right? Doing consultation, talking with departments or stakeholders that are significantly influenced by those policies, looking to see, do we have notes? Did we discover a point of friction that maybe didn't need an off-cycle change, but now because we're up for comprehensive review and the policy is open, we want to make that change now. Again, on the board policy side, it's not unusual for a policy to not need changes, and if that's the case, it routes off there to the right side of the screen. Otherwise, then the policy implementer will create a draft. That draft then goes through certainly some internal reviews first. Not everyone writes in sort of policy text or language, so making sure those align to conventions. And then once ready, the next step there on the bottom of the cycle is to consult with shared governance and key groups. So going back to the groups that the implementer or the owner talked about in the review, but there's also a formal step within the University Senate where policies are routed through various committees or the University Senates to make sure that shared governance has an opportunity to review those policies. On the board side, that is the vast majority of policies, certainly policies that are very specific to the board and how the board does its work don't go through that type of review, but everything else does, and certainly on the administrative side. On approval, so that certainly for board policies is the board, since they are ultimately your policies. Board policies are reviewed at one meeting and action is taken at a subsequent meeting. That allows, like any action item that comes before the board, like the operating budget, for example, time for members of the public and the university community to weigh in, to provide comments, feedback to the board. They can watch the deliberations, they can watch the presentation, and then provide feedback. Board policies, we try to line up to come back at a subsequent meeting, but if there's more work needed, if the board raises questions or if there's a lot of feedback that comes in from the university community, that can stretch out and then return later when the policy is ready to go. Once finally approved by the board, then it's implemented. So Director Gross, did you want to highlight the sort of the differences on the administrative side?
Absolutely. Just like our policies, we probably have more maroon bubbles around our diagram because there's a lot more steps we have. The policy owner takes care of probably the whole right side of it to begin with. They do the draft, they meet with their management. They go out and do that consultation with shared governance. Building off of what Jason said, 87% of the administrative policies are tagged to go to one or more of the committees in Senate governance at their request. This was set up about 10 years ago. So they're seeing and weighing in on almost all of those. We also do an equity lens review at that point of our policy development process. Once they're ready with that, it comes to me for a pre-review, but then we have two committees. One of them charged directly by the president, called the President's Policy Committee, to act on her behalf on administrative policies. And so it's almost every direct report she has, and it's every new policy major changes and those to be retired. And the only reason why they get the retired is because that could create a gap or cause a conflict then with another policy that may be leaning on top of that policy. We do put it out for 30-day review, just as you have an opportunity for the community to weigh in. We actually invite comments. So in the brief, we will send out a notification saying these are up for review. It's on our website. We gather all that information, make whatever changes, and then we publish. So we have a lot of opportunities and stop points for the individuals impacted by these policy changes to weigh in. And then we come back around in year 4 and do the same thing again. So about 4 years ago, there was a new addition to board policy development, and that was to have a regular review occur on university policies. It was given to the president or to a designate. That alignment started right after that between administrative policy and board policies. And in that review, 44 out of alignment conditions were found. A couple of them were pretty easy, but they still needed to go through our process. The last one was the creation of a campus public art policy. Board policy required it. We did not have one. And that is coming up for the President's Policy Committee review and approval this June, actually next week. And then there are some other things that Jason and I have been doing, probably for more than a year now. We make sure that together we're able to provide this more comprehensive picture on policy development. It used to be I met with the senior leaders and talked about administrative policy, and Jason was take his same opportunity. Having it combined has actually really improved things, and we just finished 2 in the last 2 weeks. And the last thing is Jason being on our Policy Advisory Committee, so that's the group that reports up to the President's Policy Committee, has really been a key addition because he can point out things in board policy that others might not be as familiar with. So we've got a lot of catches going on in our processes now.
So let me talk through then the 2021 board policy report, which is a requirement of board policy development. It has 3 main objectives, the report, which is included in your docket. First, it's to provide the results of the policy work completed during this current fiscal year. So for 2020-21, we had 9 board policies that completed comp review with no revisions. We had 6 that were amended. That's depending on the outcome of the committee reports later today, that will increase up to 8 with 2 policies pending final approval. We consolidated 2 policies, so became 1. We have, again, those 2 pending, and then we have 1 ready for consultation. And then we have 12 that are still under review by the policy implementer. And as you heard yesterday during audit, during the Audit and Compliance Committee, right, that is certainly an impact of the pandemic. 5 of those policies, I'll just note, fall within the Academic Health Center. They're the private practice plans. And so we would expect that we'll make a lot of progress on those 12 holdovers in the coming year. It's not unusual for us to have holdovers. Certainly we want policy implementers to take the time that they need, and depending on the complexity or the number of groups that they need to consult or the content of the policy, it might take longer, but we want to ensure that there's progress being made. And one of the ways that we do that is to report this annually. For the next piece of the plan is to outline the policy work plan for the coming year. So next year we have 15 policies up for comp review. Typically it's between 14 and 16 each year. And then those 12 carried forward along with that policy ready for consultation. Like our committee work plans, there's flexibility within that plan. So as issues arise that maybe need an off-cycle change, we'll add those policies onto the work plan. I know Executive Director Steve's informed you, we've just started a review to see if there are any changes needed for the chief auditor in policy. And so if there are changes that would be needed, that would then become an off-cycle change, and we would add that onto the committee work plan. So there's flexibility there. And certainly we invite your feedback. Please look through that list of 15 up for comp review and the 12 holdovers. If there are questions, comments, areas that you are interested in, items that you would like to flag for the policy implementer, we will, of course, always pass that along. And I would say that's true of the rest of the board policies. We keep a list. that we have of items as they come up, so that we can make sure that those are identified to the policy implementer when it comes up for comp review. And certainly if it rises to the need for an off-cycle change, we'll also work to advance that as well. And so with that, Chair Mayron, we would be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate this overview. I do have one question, then I'll open it up for my colleagues as well. And that is, Director Gross, you indicated that for the administrative policies, the ones that you're directly responsible for, they go through an equity lens review at some point. There's a step in there. And my question is, do we have a similar step for our board policies?
So, Chair Mayron, not formally. You can, Director Gross can certainly talk about that. This is a newer program, and the group right now is focused on all of the administrative policies. And so, given their capacity to complete the administrative policies first, and then I think it's something for the board to consider and for us to look at adding into our process once the administrative side is completed.
Personally, just speaking for myself, I think that would be a good step to add so that we are not inadvertently, hopefully not intentionally, but inadvertently missing something.
Yeah, and Chair Mayron, if I may add, most of the people that we work with that are responsible for administrative policy are often the liaisons in the senior leader offices for board policy as well. So going through that training, I've gone through the equity lens training that Director Gross has for policy owners. And so we're also, I think, creating a lot of shared knowledge on that area, and hopefully that transfers into board policy review naturally in that way, but also having discussions going forward about how to potentially add that as a step.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments by any of my colleagues? Yes, Chair Powell.
Thank you, Chair Mayron. Really just a comment and to thank Director Gross and Associate Langworthy and the entire board staff for his tremendous diligence that goes into this work and has over a long period of time. And it's really, I think, brought us to a very, very good place. And I think we all feel confident that this holds us in good stead, as the Board of Regents. And so we're very, very grateful for the professionalism that you bring to this work. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Yes, Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So just echoing the comments of Regent Powell, the professionalism, the development of this process is really, I think, impressive and significant. And when you try to think about, how much effort you can put in to contemplate every contingency or fact circumstance that could arise, it's one of the human conditions to try to capture that. And as soon as you think you have it, something comes up that you never expected, a la flu policies and COVID and everything else. So my understanding is that with the board, if a circumstance arises that wasn't specifically contemplated by a board policy, but may kind of run up against a board policy, does the board has the capacity to suspend a policy to act, or would the board be compelled, to your understanding, Mr. Langworthy, would the board be compelled to change the policy in the moment? Do you understand? I mean, if you think it's kind of a one-off situation, can the board suspend the policy to act? How would we address that kind of an issue?
Yes.
Chair Mayron, Regent Rocha, yes, and that happened, if you recall, at the start of the pandemic with, I believe it was one of the fee categories for students. You gave us a sort of a temporary interpretation of that policy to allow for a different application at that point. So certainly the board has the ultimate authority, right? That is defined in the charter. And so much like your bylaws, you could suspend, you could change, you could amend, or you could direct the president to do something different in that moment.
Anything further?
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chair Maron. So because this came up in the dialogue over this last month or so, we were talking, because looking at it at the administrative level, where does the administrative, with administrative policy, where does that authority vest? Is it through the president, or are there different policy owners that have that capacity? How is that sort of interpretive and suspension process controlled within that context, within administrative policy?
Chair Maron and Regent Rocha, thank you. That's a great question. It's vested with the president, who gives that to the president's policy committee. During COVID-19, using that as an example, they had regular meetings with an emergency management policy committee, and there were changes that were made that had to be made quickly. Fortunately for us in our policy, we already had a process in there that said we can make changes in advance, and we still have to go through all the rest of the steps when we have that breathing space to do so. And there wasn't a lot of breathing space at the start of COVID-19. But we came back and we circled around and did it. So it's vested with the president through the committee that she charged to run for administrative policies. Does that answer your question?
Any follow-up?
Yeah, Chair Maron, thank you. It's extremely helpful, because sort of at the board level, you look to the president, but if somebody in the community were to say, well, hey, there's this issue that's come up and the policy says this, sort of the process would be to go, I guess, through the president's office. I'm just trying to understand that dynamic, because we deal with board policy all the time, but the complexity of administrative policies and the circumstances that can bump up against them would be, sort of exponentially greater. And so that's very helpful. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions? Yes. Regent McMillan.
Thanks, Chair Maron, and echoing others. Good work. Not easy work and very detailed. Nerdy, as Mr. Langworthy calls it, but awfully important. So thanks for that. So as I look at what I'll call the Langworthy gross clock on what is this, page 24, the 6 parts on the life cycle of a policy. You both alluded to, and maybe a couple times spoke about, some of the places where, that clock probably gets bogged down as you travel around it. Is there, anything you want to call out for our attention that we could be thinking about that would make the practical side of both policy review, consultation, implementation better? I mean, maybe that's too big of a challenge, but it sounds like it's mostly workload and volume. But are there process things we could do that would help from either of you?
Chair Maron.
Yes, Mr. Langwood.
Regent McMillan, I think for what we initially struggled with as we started this was not having a backstop that said board policies must be reviewed every 6 years. And so I believe you were on the governance policy committee with Regent Rocha when we codified that. That has been very helpful to make sure that the senior leader implementers understand that board policy is requiring and we're reporting. And so if things are continuing to come up, much like the internal audit plan, that's an issue. I would say beyond that, we've fallen a little bit behind, frankly, because of the pandemic. And so it's making sure that we are advancing that in the next few years. And I think beyond that, working with shared governance, working with the University Senate to make sure that when we have policies that are ready, that we can move those through, and the Senate office has been a good partner in that. But certainly there's a lot of demand for their time. And so we continue to work with them on that side.
For administrative policies, it's a very heavy lift for policy owners. There is no doubt about it. Not only do they have to make the proposed changes, know what laws influence it and what's moving in that area, the consultation we expect is extensive. We can affect with one policy every student and every employee at the university in details. And so for them to bypass some of the consultation means we might not get some critical information. It's also in sensitive policies, it's an opportunity for our community to react to it positively or negatively, but it's a chance for them to weigh in, which is one of the reasons why we have the 30-day review. So it's a lot of work for the policy owners, and they do an amazing job by the time it gets done, but it takes time. A normal comprehensive review, an easy one is probably 3 months, and a heavy one is 6, because there's balancing so many other things in their normal workflow.
Thank you.
Any follow-up? Anything further? Thank you very much for this overview, nerdy or not. It was important, and you made it as interesting as you possibly could, so we appreciate that. All right, there being no additional business before the committee, we stand adjourned. Thank you, everyone. My understanding is the meeting, the annual meeting, it starts in 15 minutes. Do you want to set a time, Executive Director Steves?
So that's 9:40.
9:40, we will start the annual meeting. Thank you very much, everyone.